8 weeks until the primary, just the primary, folks. So we're far from done here. But Andrew Davis here with Dr. Kimberly Martin from Georgia Southern University, political science professor. So our expert, as we always like to say, which is true. You've been dealing with this for a long time. So we're
boosting
talking
my ego.
Well, that's what we're here for. It's all good. We have more time to do that. I can't explain it all otherwise.
Exactly.
So wanted to talk elections because they're coming up fast and there's a lot going on here. Just got off the show a few minutes ago talking about the war in Iran and what that may be. But let's start someplace else first and get back to that. I think we were just talking off air about Rick Jackson, the governor candidate. Came out of no place. He's a multi-billionaire, basically throwing ads everywhere, using his own money to do this. What kind of effect is he having already on this race?
So one of the things that he has an advantage on is that he's got a lot of money to be able to air on television these political ads, which is something that the other candidates have not really been able to do at this point. So where there's been a void where voters haven't had a chance to get to know Chris Carr, or Burt Jones, they're now getting to know Rick Jackson in a way that they don't know these other candidates. So I've seen lots of advertisements for him on TV, and this will actually help him in the long run. Whether people will actually see him as a viable candidate to run in the general election, to take the Republican Party's nomination for governor, that remains to be seen. He's coming in kind of late. But I think it will make waves. I think it will interest some Republican voters.
Especially because nobody else is really spending any money right now. You're not seeing Burt Jones money. You're not seeing Chris Carr money, even Raffensperger. Nobody's spending, so Rick Jackson's the only one you're seeing out here right now.
Right.
And putting your name in front of everybody 8 weeks out from election can only help, I would think.
And he's been very clear about his support for President Trump. Very clear that he is sort of a MAGA warrior. And so, like I said, in the absence of these other candidates being able to do that, this actually bodes very well for him, because we know that Donald Trump, that President Trump, is still very popular among Republican voters in the Republican base. And so for those who don't know that much, Rick Jackson might seem like a good option for people.
Well, and money's such a play, too, because we've talked about it many times, everybody's got their own coffers. I think Jones has probably got the most money other than Jackson, who's spending his own, obviously, when it comes in. So they only have a limited amount to spend, though, right now, unless they start to get some momentum. So Jackson has a real advantage there.
He really does, because you can spend your own money in an election. There's no rules against that. So you can spend your own money and as much as you want in an election. If you're raising money, there are, of course, regulations around how much you can use and when you can use it. And then, of course, it all depends on how much you can raise in general. But when you are a billionaire and you have unlimited amounts, then you can just spend as much as you want and just be as reckless as you want to be. I'm not suggesting he's being reckless. I'm just saying you got a lot of money, you can use it.
But is there need to be a reaction from the Burt Jones, from the Chris Carr, and people who still think they have this nomination in play, or at least want to get to a runoff?
So right now, Burt Jones has a pretty fair advantage, a pretty fair lead. I think that candidates need to be careful at this point. Like you mentioned, we've got 8 weeks till we get to the primary. Some things can change at that time, but the big issue right now is that in Georgia, as we know, we have to do runoffs. If no candidate gets above the 50% during the primary, then we have to go to the runoff election. And so if you are, say, Burt Jones, and you're coasting in at your 40%, 45%, in the end, that doesn't get you to the finish line. That means you could potentially have to go up against someone who has as deep a pockets as Rick Jackson in the end, You might have to do that. So you want to make sure that you get your message out there early enough to solidify your lead and then push that into the primaries.
You want to be two. If you're not one, you want to be two, because that's what everybody's jockeying for probably is that second position right now.
Yes, exactly. So if you can get through the primary and win it outright, that would be the advantage going in.
Who's the biggest threat to Burt Jones right now in that runoff?
So with polls, we've taken a look at polling numbers. The next person in line, we've got Chris Carr, but he's polling so low right now. That's not really an advantage. I don't know what Rick Jackson's polling is at this point. I haven't seen a poll with him in it yet. So,
but views, are there any difference in the views that may make a difference, or is it pretty much Burt Jones's views are pretty much the same as Chris Carr's, is pretty much the same as?
Yes, definitely. So they're all in the same boat. They're all sort of pushing a similar message or a similar messaging the type of messaging that appeals to Republican voters, the type of messaging that is very supportive of Donald Trump at this point.
And on the Democratic side, Keisha Lance Bottoms has a pretty good lead over everybody out there.
Everyone.
But she, again, not spending anything, not really putting her name out there, at least on the TV side of things. She's going to end up in a runoff most likely as well.
Yeah, I would say if I had to guess, that will definitely go to a runoff, the Democratic side for governor. So Keisha Lance Bottoms is polling at about 35%, between 35 and 40%, depending on which poll you're looking at.
And just to make it clear, we need 50% or over to stay out of that runoff.
Or over. And another thing we haven't talked about is how many undecided voters there are out there. In both the Republican polls and the Democratic polls, we've got about 40% of voters who are still undecided, which means that they could either sort of peel off proportionately and help Keisha in the end, put her maybe not over the edge, but give her an advantage, or they could go to one or the other candidates.
Yeah, Jeff Duncan is the guy that everybody thought may make a big run here, but really not. The polls aren't showing. We've got an Emerson poll coming out in a couple of weeks that we've gotten a little look at, and we can't give you any numbers. And really, the numbers are very tentative at best because there are so many undecided voters. But I think Duncan's support is waning a lot more than people thought it might be.
Right. Yeah, so we could talk about a moderate Democrat and how well they might do in the general election. That might be Jeff Duncan. You know, that might be that person. But when it comes to the primaries, you're trying to vie for votes from the more extreme side of the party. And so Jeff Duncan comes in. He was a Republican for his entire life until the last year or so. He has a history and a voting history that is Republican. His views on abortion, some of the things that might turn off Democratic voters in the end. So while some Democratic voters might respect him for what he did, they might think that he's being courageous. In the end, the question is, will those same Democratic voters trust his Democratic credentials enough to say, I'm going to vote for him over someone who has solidly been a Democrat and has made a name for themselves in the state as a Democrat?
Because he's got that upward battle to get out of the primary.
That's
but
right.
From what it sounds like, or am I saying this wrong, Jeff Duncan most likely is a better candidate in the main election against a Burt Jones or someone because of the moderate views.
He could be, yeah. So he could be. So in Georgia, when you've got a state like Georgia that's a swing state, that's a very competitive state, those voters that really matter to the campaign once you come out of the primary are those independent voters. They're the ones that are going to push you across the finish line or not. So the question is, will those Democrats who are in the field right now, aside from Jeff Duncan, will they be able to pull those independent, moderate voters later on? A moderate Democrat can usually do that fairly well.
Does Keisha have that in her to draw those independent voters?
So we don't know yet. So we haven't gotten a lot of polls that have shown us what independent voters think about Keisha Lance Bottoms at this point. So I don't know. I think that some people are questioning whether she would have broad-based appeal or not, but I do think it's kind of early. So
yeah, I guess I shouldn't call her Keisha. You know, she does have a right, but you know, not like I know her that personally.
Mayor, yes.
At this point, though, with that much election left, we probably will get to know them all personally.
Yes, yes.
When we're finished, but that's so interesting because Atlanta's such a base for her.
It is,
and so many of the votes come there. But still, to win a gubernatorial election in Georgia, you can't rely only on Atlanta, correct?
You've got to court the rest of the state. And the rest of the state are coastal voters, and like in our area, and also rural voters. So it doesn't matter, you know, who the Democrat is. They're not going to get a ton of votes in rural Georgia. But there are some outlying areas. So, for instance, Albany, Macon, some areas that will garner a lot of Democratic voters. And so the question is, how well will she play with those voters who are outside of the Atlanta area?
What are you seeing here? Obviously, Chatham County by nature is pretty Democratic.
Yeah.
By nature. Statesboro, though, pretty Republican by nature.
Right.
Are we seeing a shift anywhere down on this side of things that could help that Democratic side, or is it pretty much the same as it always has been?
It's pretty consistent at this point. Yeah, so we're pretty consistent as far as votes. I think that there won't be any real change in the coastal, in the Savannah area. I think that it'll go blue no matter who the Democratic candidate is, which will also help John Ossoff or even whoever ends up being the Democratic nominee for the District 1 Congress seat, which could be anybody at this point.
I think you and I are somewhere in the race. I didn't even claim yet.
Right?
So
you didn't? I thought you did.
No, I'm sure it's in there someplace. But you're right. I mean, because it's traditionally a very Republican district. I mean, Buddy Carter's won by, dozens of points, and Jack Kingston before him, too.
Right.
So because it takes so many of those rural areas out there. Does some of the farmer things, do some of these things make a move at all in Georgia, or are we really just, if you're a Democratic voter, don't think that this is going to change very much?
So in this district, probably not. So we know that so District 1 is from the top of the state all the way down to the bottom, which doesn't just include Savannah. It also includes, it's not Statesboro, but almost touching up against Statesboro, and then going all the way down to Brunswick. We got like Midway and Darien and areas that are traditionally very Republican. And there's a good number of votes there that end up offsetting all the Democratic votes here in Savannah. I could be wrong though. I'm gonna throw that out there. I could be wrong. We've got a very unique situation in District 1 right now, where you have tons of candidates on both sides. Nobody knows who any of them are. So once the election really gets started, once we get past the primaries, they actually start getting money, national money, so that they can start running ads and they can start getting their names out there. I mean, anything could happen. We do know from the past few years with the District 1 that some candidates have been able to gain on Buddy Carter. They haven't gotten to the point where they seriously would have overtaken them, but they have been gaining, sort of steadily across the years.
That was the difference. Jack Kingston in here for years until he went and ran for Senate unsuccessfully. Basically, nobody could touch him for the longest time until he ran. But he's had a little bit more of a challenge. I think he has not garnered that support that Kingston had, or the district has changed a little bit on that.
The district has changed a little bit. So we've got a lot of people who are moving down here. We are seeing similar changing demographics the way that Atlanta area is. And so, demographics are changing, voters are changing a little bit. Not enough to put a Democratic candidate over the edge yet, but it's possible.
But it's not a battleground yet. They're not calling this a battleground. They're not even calling it purple. They're calling it nothing right now.
No, not right now.
But we have a long way to go until we figure it out because, as you said, nobody knows any of these people yet. We'll get into that in future shows because we don't have 4 hours to go into every candidate that's on the congressional side. On that side, Ossoff is starting to speak out a little bit more.
That's right.
Starting to become a little bit more vocal. I'm sure that is part of the plan, so no one can go, you didn't say anything when everything was happening. Yeah,
absolutely. So John Ossoff has some advantages right now, some huge advantages. So we know from research that being an incumbent is a huge advantage for someone. People already know where he stands. They know how he's going to vote moving forward. People are reluctant to remove an incumbent who they feel like is doing at least a good enough job. The other thing about John Ossoff is he has raised a lot of money already, far more money than Mike Collins has or Buddy Carter has. So in a way, he has the luxury, and he has no challengers, no viable challengers on the Democratic side. So he has the luxury to sit back at this point and not say and do a lot. But he wants to be careful. You can't sit back and do nothing forever. You have to make sure that you distinguish yourself from a potential challenger. At this point, he's trying to determine who his challenger is going to be and then position himself and position his message sort of in juxtaposition to that person.
Do you still fight President Trump first right now and say that's the position I'm taking because whoever's on the other side, they're going to support him, so this is my first foray into this?
I think that he could do that. I would imagine that whoever the Republican is who gets the nomination will still continue to support President Trump. We know they already do, so they'll continue.
But that's what's interesting, I guess, to me is I wonder if Ossoff doesn't start ahead and say, I'm going to fight against what President Trump is saying, knowing that Buddy Carter, that Mike Collins are already in there saying, we support Trump, we support everything they're doing, so it's initial fight, I guess you would have on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the messages are pretty quintessential, pretty standard strategic messages. Republicans are hitting Democrats on being like, weak on border security, weak on crime, weak on foreign policy. These are pretty standard messaging. And so I think that Ossoff's team knows that that's going to continue into the future, and they're trying to make sure that their messaging is the kind of messaging that can try to combat that.
Yeah, and right now, Collins, from what we're seeing, seems to have an edge over Buddy Carter. What's interesting is that then it's the question when you get to the main election after a runoff would be who has the best chance to beat Jon Ossoff.
Right.
And that's what will be very interesting as voters go through if they care, or maybe they will care when it comes to that runoff.
Yeah, it's hard to say at this point. Mike Collins, Buddy Carter both have very similar messages. And so I guess the question is, how are they going to differentiate themselves once they get past the primary? Because they're going to have to differentiate themselves if they want to grab those independent voters, if they want to grab those moderate voters, who, as we've mentioned, they're going to need to be able to win the election.
Because there are a lot of moderate voters in Georgia right now.
Yeah. And one thing we hadn't talked a lot about was sort of the effects of immigration and the ICE raids on this. It puts Republicans in an interesting position, because we know right now polls are showing us that in general, nationally, people are unsupportive of ICE tactics and ICE raids and the way things are going. Not Republicans. Republicans are supportive, and they're pretty strong in that support, which is great if you're a Republican running in the primary.
Yeah.
But then you're a Republican running in the general election in Georgia. What do? How do you change your messaging when it comes to immigration? Knowing that those moderate and independent voters that you need, maybe you're looking at your answer to if you're supportive of ICE and ICE tactics.
Well, and we're seeing a little bit larger when it comes to some of these protests that are out there and things too in Chatham County and beyond. More people are showing up, perhaps. Whether that turns into votes, we don't know yet.
Right.
And, when you look at President Trump, when you look at a lot of these elections, it's those voters who were silent that came out at the polls too. But it's interesting to see more of those people. And you talked about the immigration factor is huge.
Yeah.
And how much do Hispanic voters come in, but also people who just feel for these situations. And then it's all those workers there. I mean, that's a significant part of our population.
It really is. So like I said, as we know nationally, it's something like 38% of voters, or 38% of the population agree with ICE and with the ICE raids and tactics. And so the disagreement is particularly focused on independent voters, young voters, and persons of color. All voters that the candidate would need to be able to win. And so that might actually end up being sort of a make or break issue for these independent voters to decide whether they go with the Republican candidate or whether they go with the Democratic candidate.
Well, and the cycle, though, moves so fast. I mean, we expected to talk about ICE on TV today.
Yeah.
And instead we're talking about the war.
That's right.
Or the conflict, whatever you want to call it there.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing. And you expected ICE to be here, or Epstein.
Yeah.
Where does that all fit in, and where does that come by November, too, when we're talking about the full election? Yeah. Texas is also interesting because we're going to see what happens there on the moderate. It's Tallarico.
That's right.
Tallarico and Crockett. Not that we're, but nationally, that'll be very interesting to see because she is much more liberal.
Yes.
And a fighter on that level. Tallarico has made a name for himself through social media and being a little bit more moderate.
Yes.
So how do Texas voters, and then how does that play to Georgia? I wonder if you have thought.
So I feel like we can sort of go back to, we want to make sure. So in Texas, very similar. I think voters in Georgia are a bit more moderate when it to Texas. I think we can firmly say that
most people are more moderate than most Texas voters. So
so you've got two candidates that are different. One that has very strong Democratic credentials. One who is very outspoken. One who is a very sort of go-getting opponent of the president and Republicans. And then you've got sort of this moderate on the other side. I don't know. I wonder in Texas if there will be a factor among Democratic voters about, who has a greater likelihood of winning a general election. Maybe I like this person, but I'm not sure this person is going to win the election if we move them out of the primary. Yeah. So I almost wonder if there would be a little more strategic thinking in Texas as opposed to sort of what we're seeing in Georgia at this point.
Are voters that smart, though? Are they thinking that far ahead these days?
So usually voters aren't necessarily that smart. Usually it's the party that drives that. A good example of that is a few years ago when Hillary Clinton was running against Bernie Sanders for the nomination for president. Bernie Sanders was doing very well. People really love Bernie Sanders. And the party and elites in the party kind of stepped in and said, we think Bernie's great, but we don't think he's going to win a general election. And so, they encouraged, I guess, people to go for Hillary Clinton, which she ended up winning the nomination and then going on and then not winning the general election. So usually in those cases, it's the party that makes the push to voters, hey, we think this candidate would be a better option for you.
Because we talk about the Trump endorsement for Burt Jones at this point, and he has not endorsed for Senate yet.
No.
You don't know. Probably Buddy Carter, but I think it's whoever wins. I think he's probably going to sit it out would be my assumption.
I wonder if he'll sit it out. Buddy Carter has been a strong supporter of his over the years. Buddy Carter has done a lot to help Trump out, but so is Mike Collins. So I almost wonder if Trump will sit it out on this one.
But then look at the Democratic side. There's nobody there to give that boost anymore.
No.
There's not the, Joe Biden is not a boost to anybody if he came out. Obama probably would be, but where does that come and how does that play in Georgia? Same thing for Kamala Harris. I'm very popular, but is that an audience that you already have? But in the last election, the African Americans minority vote went towards the Republicans farther. So they still need to court a lot of that, and maybe a Kamala or someone has to come out and start supporting these locals.
Some Georgia politicians who might be good endorsements. I mean, if John Ossoff were to support someone for governor, that might be helpful. Because then they kind of form sort of a pseudo ticket, you know, and then you make sure that you don't have a lot of split ticket voters who are voting for John Ossoff and then the Republican, So John Ossoff could be a good option for an endorsement if they're looking for one. Stacey Abrams could also potentially be a good endorsement.
Has she lost some of her luster, though, after the last turn and really didn't do as well in the governor's races as maybe you thought?
I think primarily because she's sat out since that. John Ossoff is still in public office. He still has that big microphone moving forward that Stacey Abrams doesn't have. But Stacey Abrams is still a fairly big fixture in Democratic politics in the state, particularly in the Atlanta area. And so her endorsement could go a long way with that Democratic base in the area.
Yeah, because we have to see if anybody's going to start endorsing in the states or state by state to try to make a difference, or if they all say, let's play hands off right now, too, because there's no one that galvanizes people. I think you look at Obama, and even Obama out there is not number one on people's lists. They still have anger towards him, so his audience is such, but it maybe not be the audience you're looking for on the moderate side. And that's my question is I don't think there's a Democrat that's going to come and swoop in and make a big difference and get you 3 to 5 points.
No, and I wonder about the Obama effect. I mean, he's still popular among Democrats, but he's not a state, he's not a state politician. He doesn't, him endorsing towards the end might be a good idea, towards the push towards the end in November of the general election. But as far as being a state fixture, people might not think that he's as influential on the state level.
So just to wrap it up, as we'll come back in about 2 weeks here and look at what's next. Only 6 weeks then. It feels like it's forever.
I know.
And then we haven't gotten close to the main election yet. What are the things you think in the next 2 weeks we need to be watching out for that go ahead and tell us this is movement someplace?
Right. So I would say in the next 2 to 4 weeks, watch for these candidates to start advertising and getting their message out more. There's going to be that strategic push. At this point, they're conserving their money. They're conserving their funds until they get closer to the primary. The average voter isn't really even thinking about the primaries. I know it seems very close for us, because we've been thinking about it and talking about it. But for the average voter, Iran happened, immigration happened, but they're not thinking about the primaries. When they do have to start thinking about the primaries, that's when you're going to start seeing these campaigns really ramping up and really rolling out their messages.
Yeah, it should
so
be
I'd watch for that.
Yeah, the next 2 weeks we'll see a lot more ads.
A lot more ads.
So all of you can start complaining now about all the political ads that'll be on our air for the next, 9 months now. So, but it'll be interesting to see who's starting to roll out those ads and who's going to try to make a difference here. We've got an Emerson poll that will come out Thursday as well, depending on when this airs. So you'll have that on WSAV and also on WSAV.com. GSU.com to see exactly what the numbers say, and we'll analyze a little bit more of those as well, and the 17 other polls that will probably come out in the meantime.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Dr. Kimberly Martin from Georgia Southern, and I'm Andrew Davis here. We'll be on the political beat for you all year long. Yes, all year long. But in the meantime, we'll get you ready for the primaries in the meantime. So that's what we got.
All right.